Close your eyes and step back with me into the fading twilight of an English December. Feel the sharp, biting chill of the Norfolk air seeping through the heavy stone walls of Sandringham Estate, carrying with it the damp, earthy scent of winter pine and cold soil. Listen to the distant, muffled crackle of a coal fire burning in the nursery hearth, its faint amber light struggling to pierce the thick, velvet-draped gloom of the Victorian era. The myth of royalty suggests that princes are born bathed in golden confidence, wrapped in the undeniable certainty of a divine right to rule, breathing air that tastes of triumph. The truth, however, is much quieter, much colder, and often smells faintly of starched wool and strict discipline. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We begin our journey on the 14th of December 1895, a date that arrives wrapped in mourning. It is the exact anniversary of the death of Queen Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert. To be born on this day is to enter the world as a breathing apology to a grieving monarch. The baby, christened Albert Frederick Arthur George, but known softly in the quiet corners of the nursery as Bertie, is an offering to appease the matriarch, and appease her he does, though it is a heavy burden for a tiny chest to carry. He is the second son, a spare, in a world that only ever truly looks at the heir. His older brother David, the future Edward VIII, is already the golden child, bright, quick, and naturally charismatic. Bertie is different. He is prone to tears, deeply sensitive, and easily startled by the loud, booming reality of his royal existence. His father, the future king, George V, runs the royal household not as a family, but as a naval dreadnought, complete with deafening barks of command and an obsession with precise timing. Historians still argue whether George V actually uttered the infamous phrase, "I was terrified of my father, and I am going to see to it that my children are terrified of me." But looking at the rigid, joyless structure of Bertie's childhood, one can easily see why the quote has survived the test of time. It is an environment where affection is scheduled and approval is measured in the exactness of a salute. Imagine the nursery not as a place of play, but as a waiting room for duty. The royal children are managed by a succession of terrifying nannies, formidable women who likely ironed the children's socks while wearing expressions that could effortlessly curdle fresh milk. He is surrounded by tutors and governesses, a small army of adults dedicated to forging a prince out of a boy who would much rather be left alone to watch the winter birds scatter across the frozen lawns. For a boy like Bertie, whose nervous system hums like a fragile wire in a high wind, this relentless pursuit of perfection is agonizing. His body itself becomes a battleground for royal standards. When it is noticed that he is naturally left-handed, he is forced, day after painful day, to write with his right hand, a common practice of the time, but one that fractures a child's natural rhythm. When his knees are deemed insufficiently straight for a future military officer, he is fitted with painful metal splints, wearing them day and night to forcibly correct his posture. He is treated in some ways like a rare, highly flammable piece of antique furniture that occasionally needs to be paraded before the terrifying Queen Victoria, polished and utterly silent. It is within this crucible of constant correction and emotional frost that the first signs of his defining struggle begin to emerge. The words that form in his bright, inquisitive mind find themselves trapped behind the tight, anxious muscles of his throat. The stammer begins slowly, a hesitation on a hard consonant, a swallowed syllable during a tense dinner, a breathless pause when his father's sharp eyes lock onto him. It is not a lack of intelligence. It is a physical manifestation of his environment, a profound internal logjam created by a world that demands absolute flawlessness from a boy who just wants to be loved as he is. While David charms the visiting dignitaries with effortless grace, Bertie shrinks into the shadows, his silences growing longer, his fear of speaking becoming a heavy, suffocating cloak. Yet, beneath this fragile exterior, a quiet, stubborn resilience is gently taking root. The boy who cannot speak fluently is learning to observe deeply. He watches the mechanisms of the monarchy from the peripheral vision of the second son. He sees the heavy toll that the crown exacts on his grandfather, King Edward VII, and later on his father. He understands, perhaps better than his dazzling older brother, that the throne is not a prize to be won, but a cage gilded in duty. Even his early ventures outside the nursery walls, intended to harden him into a proper royal figure, become grueling tests of endurance, plagued by a deeply ingrained dread of failure that stalks him like an inescapable phantom. The Sandringham estate, despite the rigid rules of his father, also offers him fleeting moments of genuine peace. Out on the frosty moors, away from the demanding eyes of the court, he learns the slow, deliberate rhythms of nature. He discovers a love for simple mechanical things, taking apart watches, understanding how gears and springs work together in hidden harmony. In a world of unpredictable human emotions and impossible expectations, there is immense comfort in things that can be fixed, things that make perfect logical sense. He does not know it yet, but this instinct to repair, to find the hidden mechanism and make it function again, is the very trait that will one day save the entire British monarchy from collapse. The shadow he lives in is incredibly deep, cast long and dark by his brother's shining destiny. But shadows are also places of profound, quiet growth. They hide the vulnerable while they gather their necessary strength to face the coming daylight. As the Edwardian era slowly reaches its opulent zenith and begins its inevitable, tragic decline toward the cataclysm of the First World War, Prince Albert remains largely unseen by the vast public eye. He is merely the stuttering prince, the nervous boy, the afterthought of the grand royal succession. The world is looking entirely in the wrong direction, mesmerized by the air, completely unaware of the spare who quietly watches from the wings. But history is remarkably patient. It waits in the cold Norfolk twilight, carefully listening to the hesitant, halting voice of a boy who is slowly, painfully learning exactly how to survive the immense, crushing weight of his own family name. The extraordinary journey ahead of him is fractured, deeply uncertain, and fraught with a kind of terror that traditional armies never have to face, the exquisite terror of a single, solitary voice echoing in an endless, expectant, deafening silence. And as the nursery fire finally burns down to its last glowing embers, surrendering to the encroaching chill of the evening, the small boy sleeps peacefully, entirely unaware of the magnificent, devastating storm that is already gathering on the distant horizon, a storm that will eventually strip away absolutely everything he knows and leave him standing alone in the brightest, harshest light of all. The dawn breaks over the Solent, bringing the harsh, salty sting of sea air and the relentless, driving rhythm of uncompromising naval discipline. We follow Bertie away from the quiet, velvet-draped shadows of Sandringham and into the stark, unforgiving corridors of the Royal Naval College at Osborne. Here, the myth of royal privilege collides with the brutal reality of an Edwardian boarding school, smelling perpetually of boiled cabbage, floor wax, and adolescent anxiety. For a boy already struggling to find his voice, Osborne is less an education and more a relentless endurance trial. He is simply Cadet Windsor, entirely alone in a sea of identical uniforms. His stutter is no longer a private family shame quietly managed by governesses, but a public spectacle for ruthless schoolboys. Imagine the suffocating panic of standing before a dusty blackboard, the dry texture of white chalk crumbling against sweating fingers, while a room full of peers waits in heavy, expectant silence. The harder he tries forcing words out, the more firmly his throat locks, a physical rebellion against his desperate willpower. His academic records are a quiet testament to his struggle. He routinely places at the bottom of his class, proving that while naval discipline might forge an excellent fleet, it is a terrible instrument for extracting mathematics from a frightened child. The stammer becomes a towering, invisible wall between him and the rest of the world. It is a temperamental beast, unpredictable and cruel, choosing the most inconvenient moments to strike with paralyzing force. He can sing flawlessly with the choir or memorize intricate naval codes, but a simple good morning to a commanding officer can trap him in a breathless, agonizing loop. Medical science of the era, in all its confident ignorance, approaches his affliction with the subtlety of a blacksmith attempting to repair a pocket watch. Historians still marvel with a grim sense of irony at the popular medical advice of the time. Prestigious doctors genuinely prescribed heavy smoking as a legitimate treatment to soothe the vocal cords and calm the frayed nerves of stutterers. It is a tragically flawed remedy, wrapping the young prince in an acrid cloud of tobacco smoke, but doing absolutely nothing to untangle the knotted muscles of his throat, silently laying the dark groundwork for a much deadlier health crisis decades later. Yet Bertie complies, puffing obediently on Turkish cigarettes, hoping the warm ash and glowing ember will somehow burn away the hesitation on his tongue. As he grows into a young man, the inescapable demands of his rank pull him toward the public stage, a prospect that fills him with a cold, metallic dread, tasting distinctly like an old copper penny trapped under the tongue. He is expected to perform the traditional ceremonial duties of the second son, opening regional hospitals, visiting noisy industrial factories, and delivering the dreaded public addresses. It is during these early, highly publicized speeches that the true visceral agony of his condition is laid bare for the watching world to see. Picture the painful scene. A grand civic hall, the air thick with the smell of damp wool coats and eager anticipation, hundreds of eyes fixed upon a young man trapped in a stiff military uniform. The silence that follows his grand introduction is never respectful. It is suffocatingly awkward. The long stretching seconds tick by like slow, heavy iron hammer blows as he fights a visible, exhausting war with his own diaphragm. His jaws clench tight, the veins in his neck stand out, his anxious eyes dart away from his speech, and the entire room collectively holds its breath, trapped in a shared, painful embarrassment. He is acutely aware of the heavy wave of pity radiating from the audience, an emotion far more crushing to a royal ego than outright hatred or anger. He watches his father, the king, grow increasingly impatient with every faltering syllable, a grim, silent reminder that in the pragmatic House of Windsor, visible weakness is a luxury they simply cannot afford to entertain. Meanwhile, his older brother David moves through the world like a creature of pure light, his speeches flowing effortlessly like poured champagne, his easy smile disarming presidents and commoners alike. The stark contrast between the two brothers is sharp, unforgiving, and deeply woven into the fabric of the public consciousness. David is the dazzling, undisputed future of the empire. Bertie is merely the unfortunate, stuttering background detail, the understudy no one ever expects to take the lead. But what the public, and perhaps even his own family, completely fails to see is the incredible quiet courage required simply to show up day after day, to know with absolute certainty that you are going to fail publicly, to feel the visceral terror of impending silence creeping up your spine, and to walk up to the microphone anyway. That requires a resilience far deeper than the breezy charm of his older brother. The stammer, while it mercilessly silences his voice, does not silence his mind. He becomes an astute, silent observer of human nature, and forced by his condition to meticulously read the body language and fleeting micro-expressions of those waiting for him to speak. He learns to distill his thoughts, desperately searching his vocabulary for simpler words, mapping out different linguistic pathways in his head to express the complex ideas swirling within. Through this silent suffering, he develops a profound, unspoken empathy for the marginalised, the broken, and the struggling, an empathy born directly from the ashes of his own daily humiliation. This deep well of emotional understanding remains securely hidden beneath his shy, socially awkward exterior, a secret, vital reservoir that he will desperately need to draw from in the dark, world-shattering years to come. In the grand, sweeping tapestry of his life, the stammer is often viewed simply as a tragic obstacle to be overcome, a cruel flaw in an otherwise decent, ordinary man. But look closer, and you will see that the stutter is actually the fierce crucible that forges his enduring character. It strips him of arrogance. It completely denies him the seductive path of charismatic leadership, and it forces him to painstakingly build a foundation of quiet, unyielding duty. He slowly learns that he cannot effortlessly command a room with a booming voice, so he must eventually learn to hold it completely captive with his unwavering presence. The world continues to spin past him, rushing toward the roaring 20s, a dizzying new decade of jazz music, speed, and reckless, glamorous abandon. Birdie remains a deliberate anchor. In an accelerating world, a young man trapped in the amber of his own profound hesitation, still searching the horizon for a safe way to break the glass and let his true voice finally ring out. As he stands hesitantly on the precarious precipice of adulthood, the cold echoes of the Sandringham nursery have long faded, only to be replaced by the relentless roar of a waiting empire demanding a voice he is not yet entirely sure he can provide. The relentless roar of the waiting empire begins to fade, gracefully replaced by the soft ancient sigh of the Scottish wind sweeping over the vibrant purple heather. We leave the stark, unforgiving corridors of naval discipline far behind and travel north to the deeply shadowed, fiercely romantic stones of Glamis Castle. Breathe in the rich, earthy aroma of burning peat, mingling seamlessly with the delicate, dry scent of ancient leather-bound books and damp wool. This is the ancestral home of the Bowes Lyon family, and it is here, amidst a sprawling, wonderfully chaotic brood of children, hunting dogs, and muddy riding boots, that Birdie finally finds a rhythm his anxious heart can safely follow. The myth of royal courtship often paints a picture of swift, glittering fairy tales, where destinies are instantly sealed with a polite nod across a crowded ballroom, and marriages are efficiently arranged on crisp, diplomatic parchment. But the reality of Prince Albert's pursuit of Lady Elizabeth Bowes Lyon is entirely different. It is a slow, quiet, and deeply stubborn siege of the heart. Elizabeth is everything the rigid, terrifying housewife of Windsor is not. She is vibrantly alive, possessing a warm, sparkling charm that effortlessly draws people to her like weary travellers to a gentle hearthfire. When Birdie looks at her, the suffocating memory of metal legs splints, and the terrifying echoes of his father's barking commands simply melt away into the cool, damp Scottish mist. But when he finally gathers the immense courage to ask her to marry him, fighting past the familiar, tightening grip of his stammer to offer her his fragile heart, she does the unthinkable. She says no. Being a Windsor, being Bertie is entirely unaccustomed to the word no. It is practically a foreign language to the royal ear, rather like ancient Latin, only much more personally perplexing and deeply inconvenient. It simply does not compute in the aristocratic mindset that a lady of the realm would gently refuse a prince of the blood. Yet Elizabeth does not reject the man. She rejects the invisible, suffocating cage that constantly surrounds him. She is terrified of the royal fishbowl, the relentless public scrutiny, and the terrifying prospect of never again being free to think, speak, or act as an independent woman. She knows all too well the heavy toll that the crown exacts on its royal captives, having seen the deep, anxious shadows lingering in Bertie's own gentle eyes. He is heartbroken, yet he does not retreat into the shadows as he did in his childhood. For a man who has spent his entire life stubbornly forcing words past a locked throat, a simple refusal is merely another towering wall to carefully, patiently dismantle. His quiet resilience, forged in the bitter fires of his early humiliation, now becomes his greatest and most endearing asset. He asks again and again. With profound regret and a tender hand, she refuses him, fearing the loss of her beloved freedom. It is at this highly delicate juncture that a fascinating historical truth completely upends the traditional unspoken rules of royal engagement. The formidable Queen Mary, a woman so completely steeped in monarchical tradition that she is widely rumoured to bleed royal blue, realises that her fragile second son is hopelessly adrift without this specific anchor. In an astonishing break from the rigid protocols of the era, which usually demanded princes marry foreign princesses of equal royal rank, the Queen personally travels to the delightfully chaotic Glamis castle to investigate this stubborn Scottish girl. Dropping the impeccably starched, jewel-encrusted Queen Mary into the tumbling, lively world of the Bowes-Lyon household is rather like placing a priceless, fragile Ming vase in the centre of a lively village tavern. Yet the stoic matriarch is profoundly moved by what she witnesses. She sharply observes Elizabeth's effortless warmth, her steadying, grounding presence, and the remarkable way Bertie's agonising stammer magically softens into a manageable quiet hesitation whenever she is simply standing near him. The Queen returns to the strict confines of London and quietly declares that Lady Elizabeth is the absolute only girl who can make her son happy, implicitly giving her powerful blessing to a match that would forever alter the Windsor bloodline and the very nature of the British monarchy. Empowered by his mother's exceptionally rare approval and driven by a quiet, desperate love, Bertie persists in his gentle campaign. He does not offer her absolute power, for he has no desire for it himself, nor does he offer her the grand throne, for that massive burden firmly belongs to his dazzling popular brother, David. He offers her exactly what he is, a damaged, deeply honourable man who desperately needs a safe harbour from the relentless storms of his own mind. He solemnly promises her a quiet domestic life, as far removed from the glaring centre of the royal stage as a prince can possibly manage. Finally, in the crisp, hopeful dawn of early 1923, the formidable fortress of Elizabeth's reluctance gently yields to the undeniable depth of his quiet devotion. She accepts his third, painstaking proposal, not out of a sudden glittering desire for royalty, but out of a profound, fiercely protective love for the vulnerable man beneath the stiff military uniform. Their wedding is a moment of brilliant, unexpected warmth in an otherwise stoic and formal era. As they stand before the grand altar at Westminster Abbey, the sweet scent of spring lilies briefly masks the cold, ancient smell of the carved stone monuments surrounding them. Elizabeth famously pauses on her slow way down the aisle to lay her bridal bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior, a spontaneous, deeply moving gesture of raw empathy that instantly and permanently endears her to the weary British public, perfectly signalling the compassionate new era she brings to the rigid royal family. Behind heavily guarded closed doors, their marriage quickly becomes an impenetrable fortress of domesticity. Elizabeth does not try to forcefully cure his stammer with the harsh disciplinary tactics of his terrifying youth. Instead, she simply waits. She gives him the priceless, healing gift of time, gently holding his hand beneath the formal dinner table when the agonizing words refuse to come, her steady, calm presence acting as a vital grounding wire for his erratic, surging nervous energy. She builds a protective, invisible wall of warmth around him, deliberately filling their homes with bright laughter, informal dinners, and a startling, wonderful lack of military precision. They are blessed with 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, creating a small, fiercely tight-knit family unit that Bertie fondly, proudly refers to as us 4. Within this quiet, loving sanctuary, the nervous prince, who was once terrified of his own shadow, finally begins to take deep, calming breaths. He finds a sense of ordinary, profound happiness that entirely eclipses the grand, sweeping, often cold dramas of the royal court. He is perfectly content to remain the Duke of York, a dedicated, loving family man, a steady, unremarkable pillar of the grand establishment, while his older brother continues to effortlessly capture the dazzling, dangerous spotlight of the world's rapt attention. He believes, with every single fibre of his being, that he has successfully, permanently escaped the crushing, terrifying weight of the legendary crown. He believes the painful, agonizing struggles of his youth have finally earned him the ultimate right to a quiet, predictable, beautiful life in the gentle embrace of the incredible woman who saved him. But destiny, much like the unpredictable, swirling Scottish weather that first brought them together, is already gathering dark, unseen clouds just over the jagged horizon, quietly preparing to tear the fragile roof completely off his carefully constructed sanctuary and forcefully thrust him out into a terrifying, world-altering storm he never once asked to weather. While Bertie carefully builds his quiet fortress of domesticity, constructing a life that smells comfortingly of dried lavender, warm afternoon tea, and freshly sharpened pencils, a different glittering world is spinning wildly out of control just a few miles away across London. The golden brother, David, known to the cheering public as the glamorous Prince of Wales, is riding the roaring crest of the era with the reckless abandon of a man completely untethered from consequence. Listen closely to the shifting winds of the decade, and you can almost hear the syncopated, frantic rhythm of a jazz band echoing down the usually silent, solemn, tapestry-draped corridors of the royal residences. David is the definition of modern, restless glamour, his life a whirlwind of transatlantic ships, flashing cameras, and endless parties. He smells of expensive, imported tobacco, sharp citrus cologne, and the intoxicating, dangerous aroma of unyielding privilege. For Bertie, a wildly unpredictable and adventurous evening involves perhaps staying up a half hour past bedtime to stubbornly complete a particularly difficult jigsaw puzzle of a cloudy Scottish landscape. But David's social calendar reads like a frantic, glittering manifesto of high society indulgence. The stern patriarch, King George V, watches his heir's frivolous antics from the twilight of his life, with a deepening cold despair settling heavily in his tired bones. It is a stark, well-documented historical truth that the aging king deeply troubled by what he saw, chillingly prophesied the coming disaster, reportedly telling an advisor, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." And adding a fervent prayer that absolutely nothing would ever come between his shy second son and the grand throne. It was a staggeringly accurate, tragic prediction from a formidable man who generally preferred the quiet, predictable company of his postage stamp collection to the messy, complicated, emotional lives of his own offspring. The old rigid era officially and violently shatters in the freezing, dark January of 1936, as the bitter winter winds howl endlessly over the stark roofs of Sandringham. King George V breathes his last, and the heavy, ancient crown smoothly but inevitably passes to his eldest son. The golden brother is now King Edward VIII. The initial public reaction across the globe is a massive wave of ecstatic, blinding adoration as the handsome, unmarried, seemingly modern king appears to promise a fresh, vibrant, exciting future for an empire still quietly nursing the deep psychological scars of the First Great War. Historians still fiercely argue whether Edward's immense rock star popularity was a genuine political phenomenon representing a true, deep-seated desire for royal modernization, or simply the very first modern instance of obsessive, superficial celebrity worship completely masking a profound lack of constitutional substance. Regardless of the sociological cause, behind the heavy velvet curtains of the palace, the dazzling, perfect illusion begins to rapidly dissolve, almost the exact moment the invisible weight of the crown touches his impeccably styled blonde hair. The new king is entirely impatient with the slow, grinding machinery of statecraft. He is easily bored by towering stacks of official state papers, frequently returning highly confidential government documents back to the cabinet offices decorated with careless wet rings from condensation-soaked cocktail glasses. The senior courtiers, elderly men who have spent their entire adult lives perfecting the delicate, silent art of remaining completely invisible while faithfully serving the massive apparatus of the state, find themselves collectively, quietly hyperventilating in the dimly lit shadows of Whitehall. They watch in silent horror as the king openly dismisses centuries of careful tradition in favour of what he deems modern efficiency, a modern efficiency that suspiciously looks exactly like doing whatever he pleases, whenever he pleases. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, paces the thick, luxurious carpets of Downing Street with a heavy, sinking heart, slowly realising that the unwritten British Constitution, a delicate web of ancient precedents and gentlemanly assumptions, is entirely unequipped to handle a sovereign who simply refuses to politely play by the established, unspoken rules. But the true, absolute catalyst of the approaching world-altering earthquake is not merely Edward's administrative negligence. It is the arrival of an impeccably dressed, terrifyingly witty, intensely ambitious American woman named Wallis Simpson. She is not royalty, she is not British, she possesses a sharp, biting intellect that leaves traditional aristocrats thoroughly bewildered. More dangerously, she is married, and not for the first time, carrying a complex romantic history that completely disqualifies her from any formal role in the rigid hierarchy of the Church of England, of which the king is the supreme governor. The impending scandal is not a sudden, violent explosion, but rather a slow, suffocating, invisible leak of toxic air seeping into the sealed, sterile, highly pressurized chamber of the British establishment. The quiet whispers begin to multiply, mutating from soft rumours into frantic, undeniable facts. You can almost feel the panicked rustle of heavy silk skirts and hear the muted, anxious clearing of aristocratic throats echoing endlessly through the vast, drafty drawing rooms of elite London society. The scent of sheer panic, sour and sharp, slowly begins to overpower the soothing, familiar fragrance of expensive beeswax polish and fresh-cut flowers that usually perfumes the endless palace corridors. The British press, operating strictly under an unspoken, incredibly tight gentleman's agreement with the royal palace, suppresses the explosive story from the general public, creating a bizarre, deeply surreal atmosphere where the entire world outside Britain seems to know all about the king's illicit romance, except the very people he is actively ruling. Bertie watches this surreal, terrifyingly fast unfolding drama with a growing, freezing sensation settling firmly and permanently in the pit of his stomach. His hard-won peace, his beautiful quiet life with Elizabeth and the two young girls, is suddenly and violently threatened by the reckless actions of the very person who was always supposed to definitively shield him from the immense, soul-crushing burden of the throne. Every single time David casually shuns a vital royal duty to quickly retreat into the fashionable, exclusive, deeply private society of his American obsession, a tiny, invisible, yet catastrophic fracture runs deep through the ancient, stone foundation of the monarchy. Bertie desperately tries to gently reason with his distracted brother, attempting to bravely bridge the widening, silent chasm between sacred duty and selfish desire, but David is completely, willfully deaf to anything outside the intoxicating orbit of his own heart. The Golden Brother is walking blindfolded toward a jagged, terrifying cliff edge, completely unaware or perhaps simply uncaring that he is tightly dragging the entire 1,000-year-old institution of the British Crown right along behind him, while his stuttering, terrified younger brother stands paralysed on the crumbling shore, completely unable to find the powerful words needed to yell for him to stop. The brittle, yellow fog of early December 1936 settles heavily over the wet cobblestones of London, wrapping the city in a tense, expectant whisper that smells distinctly of damp soot and impending doom. Inside the heavily guarded walls of 10 Downing Street and the sprawling, hushed corridors of Buckingham Palace, the suffocating silence of the press finally breaks, shattering the fragile, gentlemanly illusion that has protected the monarchy for months. The story of King Edward VIII and his American obsession, Wallace Simpson, explodes across the front pages of the British newspapers with the concussive, deafening force of a physical blow, instantly transforming whispered aristocratic gossip into a paralysing national emergency. The streets of London are thick with newsboys, their voices cutting through the damp fog like sharp knives, shouting headlines that would have been completely unthinkable just a few weeks prior. Citizens stand under dim street lamps, holding the crinkling broadsheets in their gloved hands, their breath pluming in the freezing air as they read the devastating details of a romance that threatens to bring down the whole of the empire. For the first time in modern history, the impenetrable velvet curtain protecting the royal family is violently ripped away, exposing a chaotic, deeply human vulnerability that the empire is completely unprepared to witness. The very idea that a reigning monarch would willfully toss aside an empire spanning a quarter of the globe for the affections of one entirely unsuitable woman sends a profound, chilling shockwave through the collective psyche of the British public, leaving them feeling deeply betrayed, profoundly confused, and entirely untethered from their comfortable reality. You can almost feel the sheer, unadulterated panic vibrating through the thick mahogany doors of the government offices, a panic so profound it leads to the deeply British tragedy of a perfectly brewed cup of Earl Grey tea left entirely untouched to go tragically cold because the powerful men in the room are simply too terrified of the crumbling constitution to actually remember to drink it. The crisis is no longer merely a scandalous family dispute, it is a full-blown constitutional earthquake. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, exhausted and pale, delivers a stark, uncompromising ultimatum to the hopelessly distracted sovereign. He must abandon the controversial marriage, or he must abandon the sacred throne. There is absolutely no middle ground, no elegant compromise to be found within the rigid, unyielding parameters of the Church of England and the fiercely traditional British public. Historians still argue whether Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin deliberately and masterfully manoeuvred the stubborn king off the throne to efficiently rid the conservative establishment of a deeply unpredictable, politically meddlesome monarch, or if he was simply a genuinely desperate, overworked man, desperately trying to save the ancient fabric of the unwritten constitution from tearing apart entirely under the weight of one man's romantic obsession. Regardless of his true motives, the irresistible trap is firmly set, its steel jaws waiting in the quiet dark, and Edward, blinded by a devotion that borders on the fanatical, walks right into it without a single backward glance at the heavy golden legacy he is casually discarding. As the bitter reality of the situation slowly dawns on the political establishment, the frantic midnight meetings multiply, proving that an unprecedented constitutional crisis is perhaps the absolute only known phenomenon capable of making a seasoned, stoic British politician visibly sweat in the dead of the freezing winter. Through all of this frantic, swirling chaos, we find our quiet protagonist, Bertie, trapped in a rapidly shrinking island of normalcy. He watches the escalating disaster with a creeping, visceral horror that turns his hands to ice and tightens the already fraught muscles of his throat into an agonizing, unyielding knot. He desperately tries to contact his older brother, pleading for an audience, desperately hoping to inject some small measure of rational thought into the king's fevered, romantic martyrdom. But Edward becomes entirely unreachable, barricaded inside his country estate, Fort Belvedere surrounded only by a tiny echoing circle of sycophants and the ever-present, suffocating shadow of the impending abdication. When the two brothers finally do meet in the fading, melancholy light of those dark December days, the encounters are deeply tragic, painfully awkward affairs, filled with a massive, echoing void of all the desperate things that simply cannot be said. Bertie, fighting back tears and entirely paralysed by his stammer, stares at the stranger who used to be his beloved older brother, a man who is actively, willfully choosing to detonate the entire foundation of their family's historical existence for a single fleeting human emotion. The sheer, staggering weight of what is about to happen begins to slowly, mercilessly descend upon Bertie's slender shoulders, an invisible, crushing atmosphere that makes it genuinely difficult for him to draw a full, deep breath. He knows, with a terrifying, absolute certainty, that if David walks away, the massive, terrifying machinery of the British state will instantly, ruthlessly pivot to consume him next. He is the spare. He is the emergency backup mechanism, the flawed, stuttering, reluctant failsafe designed entirely for a catastrophic moment exactly like this, the quiet, beautiful, fiercely protected life he has so carefully built with Elizabeth and his two young daughters is rapidly disintegrating before his very eyes, turning to fine, cold ash in the bitter winds of his brother's staggering selfishness. He begins to completely lose his precious sleep, wandering the quiet, darkened halls of his Piccadilly home in the dead of night, listening to the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clocks that suddenly sound less like comforting timepieces and much more like the ominous, heavy countdown to his own personal execution. He weeps openly to his mother, the formidable Queen Mary, famously breaking down in her formal drawing room like a frightened child, desperately pleading for some miraculous intervention, some unseen constitutional loophole that might spare him from the terrifying, blinding glare of the crown. But the stoic matriarch, though deeply heartbroken by the shocking betrayal of her eldest son, knows exactly what the unyielding survival of the institution absolutely requires. There is absolutely no magical escape. There is no sudden, miraculous reprieve. The papers of abdication, stark and terrifying in their dry, legalistic phrasing, are slowly drawn up by weary men in dark suits, their scratching fountain pens signing away the destiny of one king and violently forging the heavy chains of another, the illusion of royal stability, the grand comforting myth that the crown rests only upon the heads of those divinely born to carry it, is entirely shattered, leaving behind a deeply fractured, highly vulnerable family standing exposed in the freezing, harsh light of a rapidly darkening world. Bertie stands on the absolute precipice of a terrifying abyss, feeling the cold, damp stone of history crumbling rapidly beneath his trembling feet. The golden brother is selfishly, finally leaving, vanishing into the romanticized, selfish exile of his own meticulous making, and he is leaving absolutely everything behind: the empire, the duty, the unimaginable pressure, and the heavy, tarnished, incredibly dangerous crown are all about to fall heavily, irrevocably, and entirely into the trembling, unprepared hands of a man who cannot even manage to clearly speak his own name without feeling the crushing, agonizing weight of absolute terror. The sharp, crackling static of the wireless radio fills the dimly lit drawing room, sounding like dry leaves being crushed under heavy boots. It is the 11th of December, 1936, and the freezing night air outside seems to hold its breath. Through the large wooden cabinet speaker, the voice of the former golden brother echoes across the globe, his carefully rehearsed melancholy tone dripping with an intoxicating mix of sorrow and defiance. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own, Edward begins, his smooth delivery carrying the unmistakable, intoxicating scent of a man who has already mentally packed his bags for warmer, less complicated shores. Historians still fiercely argue whether Edward's famous abdication broadcast was a genuine, heartbroken plea for public understanding, or simply a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation designed entirely to cast himself as the ultimate romantic martyr. But for Bertie, sitting perfectly still in a velvet armchair, his knuckles white as he grips the armrests, the broadcast is not a historical moment to be debated. It is a live audio feed of his own personal execution. He listens as his brother publicly lays down the impossibly heavy burden of the British Empire, citing the absolute impossibility of discharging his duties without the help and support of the woman he loves. As the final dramatic notes of God Save the King play over the airwaves, the music is no longer for David. The ancient, invisible machinery of the British Constitution shifts silently, ruthlessly in the dark, and the crushing weight of the crown instantly falls directly onto Bertie's trembling head. The transition of absolute power is instantaneous, requiring no formal ceremony to take immediate, terrifying effect. The very second his brother signs the instrument of abdication, Bertie is instantly transformed from a stuttering, reluctant duke into the supreme ruler of a quarter of the globe. The myth of royal ascension tells us that becoming a king is a moment of divine triumph, a glorious apex of human destiny bathed in golden light and heavenly choirs. The harsh sensory reality for the new monarch, however, smells heavily of cold cigar ash, stale nervous sweat, and the sudden, overwhelming scent of ancient, dusty parchment thrust before him by grim-faced men in dark, conservative suits. The paperwork of his ascension is handled with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a seasoned funeral director, meticulously organising a highly complicated, terribly tragic burial. He is no longer simply Prince Albert. He must now carefully select a regnal name, a choice that carries profound psychological weight in a deeply fractured empire. He chooses George VI, a deliberate, desperate signal to the weary public that he intends to faithfully resurrect the steady, reliable, and profoundly unglamorous continuity of his late father, King George V, effectively trying to erase the chaotic, glittering nightmare of the last 326 days. Elizabeth stands beside him in the quiet aftermath, her warm, grounding presence radiating a fierce, quiet anger directed entirely at the selfish brother and the American woman who have just forcefully hijacked their peaceful existence. She knows that their quiet domestic sanctuary, with its lovely afternoons of gardening and calm, uninterrupted tea times, is permanently gone, completely burned to the ground by the blinding flash of the royal spotlight. She watches her husband, a man who has spent his entire life desperately trying to hide from the public eye, suddenly thrust onto the highest, most unforgiving pedestal in the known world. His anxiety is no longer just a private, painful struggle. It is now a matter of acute national security. Every stammered syllable, every hesitant pause will now be mercilessly analysed by global ambassadors and hungry newspapers looking for any fatal sign of weakness in the fragile British system. The immediate days following the abdication are a suffocating blur of endless meetings with senior politicians, men who respectfully bow their heads but look at him with thinly veiled, terrifying doubt in their weary eyes. He must immediately learn the complex, baffling machinery of statecraft, a task made exponentially more difficult by the fact that he was intentionally, systematically kept completely in the dark regarding all matters of state by his own father, who seemingly believed practical royal training was far less important than maintaining a perfectly straight posture. He is handed towering stacks of highly classified red boxes, filled with dense, impenetrable government documents that smell of fresh ink and impending global disaster. There is a deeply terrifying realization that his personal diary, once a safe, private place to quietly record his frustrations with his golf swing, now legally belongs to the National Archives, prompting a sudden, overwhelming urge to become a significantly more boring diarist for the sheer sake of future historians. He is utterly exhausted, his nerves frayed to the absolute breaking point, yet the unrelenting schedule of a king allows no time for mourning the beautiful, simple life he has just violently lost. The shadow of his brother still looms, large and incredibly dangerous, casting a long, dark silhouette over everything Bertie attempts to do. David, now the Duke of Windsor, frequently calls the palace from his luxurious European exile, offering unsolicited, highly irritating advice on how to run the empire he just abandoned. Completely oblivious to the immense strain his voice causes his exhausted successor, Bertie eventually has to take the heartbreaking, deeply necessary step of cutting off direct phone access to his beloved brother, completely isolating himself in order to protect the fragile, healing dignity of the battered crown. The new King George VI is a man actively grieving while trying to lead a deeply shaken nation, forced to project an aura of absolute unshakable strength while internally feeling like a house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze to collapse. As he paces the vast echoing corridors of Buckingham Palace late at night, the silence is profound and heavy, broken only by the sharp, lonely click of his own polished shoes against the ancient hardwood floors. He stops before a massive, gilded mirror, staring into the tired, terrified eyes of the stranger reflected back at him, a man completely draped in the heavy, suffocating velvet of unwanted authority. He never asked for this power, he never desired the deafening applause of the crowds, and he certainly never wanted the terrifying absolute responsibility of holding an entire fracturing empire together with nothing more than his own fragile, stuttering willpower. Yet here he stands, entirely alone in the deep, velvet dark, the absolute ultimate reluctant understudy who has suddenly, violently been pushed onto the grandest stage on earth, desperately searching the shadows for a steady voice he is not entirely sure he actually possesses, quietly praying the approaching dawn will bring him the necessary strength to endure. The harsh, unrelenting dawn of May 12th, 1937 breaks over a nervous, expectant London, carrying with it the metallic scent of polished brass, damp horsehair, and the nervous, collective sweat of an empire holding its breath. The journey from the palace to Westminster Abbey is undertaken inside the legendary Gold State coach, a magnificent, heavily gilded 18th century carriage that sways violently on its ancient leather suspension like a small, highly decorated ship caught in a turbulent ocean storm. Inside the suffocatingly velvet-lined cabin, Bertie sits completely rigid beside Elizabeth, the heavy air thick with the smell of mothballs, polished brass, and his own crushing, suffocating anxiety, his fingers constantly tracing the rough, embroidered seams of his trousers. Historians still marvel at the deeply pragmatic British efficiency of the grand event. The government simply took the massive, incredibly expensive coronation ceremony already meticulously planned for the departed King Edward VIII and merely swapped the names on the printed velvet chairs and formal invitations, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the British Empire might occasionally misplace a reigning sovereign, but it would absolutely never, under any circumstances, willingly waste a perfectly good catering deposit or a well-rehearsed choir arrangement. The massive wooden doors of Westminster Abbey loom before them, smelling strongly of ancient dust, cold stone, melting beeswax candles, and centuries of silent, whispered prayers from long-dead kings. As Bertie crosses the threshold, the sheer, crushing wall of sound hits him, the rustling of 8,000 aristocratic guests draped in crimson velvet and ermine, the echoing thunderous chords of the massive pipe organ, and the sudden, terrifyingly bright glare of the newly installed newsreel lighting that makes the shadowy, Gothic nave feel like a harsh, unforgiving theatre stage. He is draped in the traditional robes of state, layers of heavy, scratchy silk, stiff gold thread, and thick fur that feel less like ceremonial garments and more like a beautifully woven, suffocating straitjacket. Every single eye in the cavernous, echoing building is fixed entirely upon him, heavily laden with unspoken questions and a lingering toxic doubt left behind by his charismatic, absent brother. The ceremony grinds forward with glacial, terrifying precision. The most sacred, intimate moment arrives when Bertie is gently stripped of his heavy crimson robes, left standing exceptionally vulnerable in a simple, stark, white linen tunic, known as the Colobium Sindonis. 4 knights of the Garter step forward to hold a shimmering golden canopy completely over his head, shielding him from the intrusive gaze of the world, and for a few brief, precious seconds, he is safely hidden in the quiet dark. The Archbishop of Canterbury pours the holy oil from the golden ampulla, the rich, intoxicating scent of ancient myrrh, sweet rose, jasmine, and cinnamon suddenly blooming in the cold, damp air as the oil is gently applied to his hands, his chest, and his head. In this hidden, quiet space, he is not a nervous, stuttering man. He is being spiritually transformed, bound irrevocably to the heavy earth of his nation, but the canopy is eventually, inevitably pulled away, thrusting him violently back into the blinding, terrifying light. The absolute climax of the suffocating ordeal rapidly approaches, the taking of the sacred coronation oath. This is the exact moment he has dreaded for months, the terrifying instant where he must speak clearly, firmly, and publicly into the intimidating metallic microphones of the BBC, his fragile voice broadcast live across the sprawling continents to millions of waiting, listening ears. The abbey falls into a deep, breathless, agonizing silence, a silence so profound you can clearly hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of pocket watches hidden beneath aristocratic waistcoats. Bertie stares at the ancient, illuminated text of the oath, his heart violently hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperately seeking escape. He feels the familiar, terrifying tightening in his throat, the invisible, suffocating hand of his stammer firmly gripping his vocal cords, viciously threatening to lock his jaw and publicly humiliate him on the absolute grandest stage in human history. He looks out into the vast sea of pale faces and frantically searches the massive crowd for the one steady anchor in his turbulent, terrifying world. He finally finds Elizabeth's eyes, fiercely calm, radiantly warm, and profoundly loving, shining softly from the dimly lit royal box. He draws a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the cold, incense-laced air, and meticulously applies the exhausting, mechanical breathing techniques he has practiced for countless grueling hours with his dedicated speech therapist. He forces the tight muscles of his diaphragm to gently release, pushing the locked air slowly, deliberately upward. When he finally speaks, his voice is not the booming, effortless roar of his golden brother, nor the terrifying, barking command of his late father. It is a quiet, strained, but absolutely unbroken sound. A slight hesitation on a difficult consonant, a tiny, pregnant pause that causes the Archbishop to nervously tighten his grip on his gilded staff, but the tragic, humiliating silence never actually falls. The words, ancient and binding, echo softly but steadily through the vast vaulted ceilings of the ancient stone abbey. He promises to govern his peoples according to their respective laws and customs, his voice slowly gathering a quiet, fierce momentum born not of natural confidence, but of sheer, unadulterated, stubborn survival. The collective silent exhale of the 8,000 guests is almost palpable, a massive wave of profound national relief washing over the cold stone floors. When the Archbishop of Canterbury finally lifts the magnificent solid gold St. Edward's crown and lowers it firmly onto Bertie's head, it feels significantly less like a divine, heavenly blessing and much more like a beautifully jeweled, exceptionally expensive anvil carefully designed to permanently compress his fragile cervical spine. But as he slowly turns to face his empire, heavily burdened by the immense physical weight of the ancient gold and the terrifying psychological weight of his new reality, a subtle, profound shift occurs within his tired soul. He has faced the absolute darkest, most terrifying phantom of his own mind, the paralyzing fear of his own broken voice, and he has successfully, publicly defeated it. He walks slowly down the long, red-carpeted aisle toward the massive wooden doors, out into the roaring, damp London afternoon. No longer the reluctant, terrified spare, but the anointed, proven king. The cheering crowds press tightly against the iron metal barricades, waving thousands of tiny paper flags, their joyful, chaotic voices completely masking the dark, ominous, highly destructive rumblings slowly gathering just across the narrow English Channel, where a much more violent, entirely terrifying test of his newly discovered endurance is already waiting patiently in the deep European shadows for the quiet, unexpected sovereign. The golden glow of the coronation fades, slowly replaced by the long, cold shadows of a darkening Europe. The air inside Buckingham Palace begins to change, losing the sweet, lingering fragrance of celebration and taking on the sharp, sterile scent of anxiety and floor wax. Outside, the wind sweeping across the English Channel feels sharper, carrying with it the faint, metallic whisper of rearmament and the distant rhythmic thud of marching boots echoing from the heart of the continent. The late 1930s are a terrifying liminal space, a tense, suffocating waiting room where the entire world collectively holds its breath. For King George VI, the hard-won victory over his own voice is immediately overshadowed by a much larger, far more sinister monster gathering strength in the East. He is not a natural diplomat, nor is he a brilliant military strategist. He is a man who genuinely loves the quiet, predictable geometry of a well-ordered garden, now forced to watch helplessly as the delicate geopolitical flower beds of Europe are ruthlessly trampled. The palace staff quietly begins the grim, surreal task of preparing the ancient, drafty residents for an entirely new kind of modern warfare. It is a strangely domestic kind of terror, involving the deeply British tragedy of trying to look perfectly dignified while being meticulously measured for a rubber gas mask that smells overwhelmingly of stale talcum powder and impending suffocation, or the profound aesthetic dilemma of trying to properly match heavy, scratchy black wool blackout curtains to the priceless, centuries-old silk tapestries without deeply offending the lingering ghosts of previous monarchs. The royal cellars, usually reserved for aging fine Bordeaux, are rapidly repurposed as reinforced bomb shelters, quietly proving that even in the face of absolute annihilation, the aristocracy still inherently prefers to take cover next to a very good vintage. In this atmosphere of escalating dread, the king seeks desperately for a peaceful solution, entirely driven by the horrific, bleeding memories of the First Great War that still profoundly haunt his traumatized generation. This desperate hope culminates in the crisp autumn of 1938, when Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returns from Munich, triumphantly waving a small, fluttering piece of white paper bearing the signature of the German Chancellor, famously declaring peace for our time. Overjoyed and immensely relieved, Bertie does something highly unprecedented. Historians still fiercely argue whether King George VI's decision to formally invite Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to stand beside him on the famous Buckingham Palace balcony to receive the cheering crowds was a deeply unconstitutional royal endorsement of a highly controversial political appeasement policy, or simply the genuine, deeply human and desperate act of a traumatized veteran frantically praying to avoid the horrific slaughter of millions of young men. It is a moment of profound, blinding relief, but it is a tragic, fleeting illusion, a desperate mirage shimmering over a rapidly drying oasis. The piece of paper is utterly worthless. As the agonizing months grind forward, the cold, hard reality of fascist expansion violently shatters the fragile dream of peace. The king slowly realizes that he has been forced to play a gentleman's game with a ruthless adversary who completely despises the very concept of gentlemanly rules. The suffocating tension in his shoulders returns, a permanent aching knot of hard muscle that settles deeply at the base of his neck, making it physically painful to turn his head. His stammer, which had miraculously, wonderfully softened after the grand coronation, violently begins to flare up again. The invisible tightening hand relentlessly gripping his throat as he wrestles with the agonizing daily briefings from his stressed intelligence officers. He retreats more often to his dark, wood-panelled study, a quiet sanctuary smelling strongly of rich pipe tobacco, old leather and ink, endlessly pacing the worn floorboards as he reads the terrifying dispatches detailing the ruthless dismantling of Czechoslovakia. The rhythmic ticking of the antique mantel clock sounds less like a measure of time and more like a heavy iron gavel slowly coming down on the fate of the free world. He knows, with a sickening absolute certainty, that the terrible crushing machinery of war simply cannot be stopped by polite diplomatic letters. Elizabeth, his steady anchor, stands quietly by his side, projecting an aura of fierce, unyielding calm, gently massaging his rigid shoulders and hiding her own profound terrors behind a warm, flawless smile. While his older brother David is safely insulated in the sunny, luxurious exile of the French Riviera, reportedly complaining about his golf handicap, Bertie is trapped in the damp, grey centre of the approaching maelstrom. The gentle man who so desperately wanted to build a quiet, safe life for his small family must now mentally prepare to lead his entire, frightened empire into the absolute darkest abyss of the 20th century. He is deeply, painfully aware of his own agonizing limitations. He is not the charismatic, roaring lion that his legendary warrior ancestors were. He cannot magically inspire an entire continent with a single fiery glance or a booming, effortless speech that commands the roaring thunder. He is merely a quiet, fragile man with a halting voice and a terrified heart, standing entirely alone on the jagged precipice of a global catastrophe. Yet, as the dark, threatening clouds finally break and the inevitable catastrophic storm actually arrives, something truly remarkable begins to quietly shift within his weary soul. The immense crushing pressure that broke his older brother entirely does not break Bertie. Instead, it slowly, painstakingly compresses his profound anxiety into a dense, unbreakable core of absolute resolve. He watches from his tall windows as the magnificent gilded treasures of the royal collection are hurriedly packed into crude wooden crates, smelling sharply of fresh pine and raw panic, to be shipped away and hidden in damp secret caves far from the capital. He watches as the beautiful, manicured lawns of the London parks are violently ripped open to build crude, muddy air raid trenches, the smell of overturned earth mingling with the exhaust fumes of military convoys. The glittering, superficial world of the royal court is entirely stripped away, violently replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of basic human survival. In the final, agonizing days of peace in late August 1939, a suffocating, heavy silence falls over the bustling capital, the kind of absolute, terrified stillness that occurs just seconds before a massive thunderclap violently shatters the sky. Bertie sits at his heavy mahogany desk, the smooth, cool wood beneath his trembling fingertips providing the only tangible anchor in a world rapidly spinning entirely out of control. The Golden Brother is a distant, fading memory, entirely useless in the face of this impending darkness. The crown upon Bertie's head is no longer merely a heavy, decorative symbol of ancient authority. It is about to become a vital, desperate beacon of hope for millions of terrified people plunging rapidly into the pitch-black night. He knows that his greatest, most terrifying battle is not going to be fought with guns, bombs, or tanks, but with his own broken, halting voice, which he must somehow find the miraculous strength to use to bind a fractured, terrified nation securely together. He takes a slow, deep breath of the stale, dusty air, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of history settle permanently into his weary bones, quietly accepting that the beautiful, peaceful life he once cherished is now entirely, permanently gone, replaced entirely by the cold, unyielding iron of absolute duty, waiting only for the final terrible declaration that will plunge them all into the fire. The morning of September 3rd, 1939 arrives not with a dramatic thunderclap, but with a weary, grey drizzle that coats the tall windows of Buckingham Palace in a cold, weeping sheen. The air inside the King's study smells heavily of damp wool, burning coal, and the sharp, undeniable scent of exhausted waiting. At 11:15, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice crackles over the wireless, officially announcing that a state of war now completely exists between Great Britain and Germany. The heavy suspended anvil has finally, mercifully fallen, completely shattering the agonizing tension of the past few days. For Bertie, sitting perfectly still in his impeccably tailored naval uniform, the global tragedy immediately distills down into a singular, terrifying personal mandate. He must speak. The myth of royal broadcasts often paints a picture of effortless eloquence, a sovereign stepping naturally to the microphone to shower their subjects with golden, unwavering reassurance, while perhaps elegantly sipping a cup of perfectly brewed tea. But the stark physical reality for King George VI is a grueling, exhausting marathon of sheer, terrified endurance. He must deliver the most important speech of his entire life, broadcasting to a sprawling empire of millions who are currently taping their windows, hoarding meagre rations, and staring anxiously at the darkening sky. The BBC technicians invade the quiet sanctity of his study, dragging thick, heavy black cables across the ancient, priceless Persian rugs, bringing with them the warm, slightly metallic odour of heated vacuum tubes and nervous perspiration. The technicians are sweating so profusely as they carefully adjust the sensitive equipment that one might reasonably assume they are actively trying to fill a new small ocean out of sheer, unadulterated panic. They place the heavy, chrome-plated microphone directly on his desk, an imposing piece of modern technology that to the king's intensely anxious eyes looks significantly less like an instrument of mass communication and much more like a highly suspicious, deeply malevolent, metallic turnip designed entirely to ruin his life. Lionel Logue, his dedicated, eccentric Australian speech therapist, stands quietly just outside the immediate frame of vision, projecting a fiercely calm aura of absolute, unwavering belief. The room is cleared, leaving the king entirely alone with the menacing chrome device and the crushing weight of the rapidly ticking clock. A small red light on the equipment console suddenly blinks to life, glowing like a tiny, watchful, incredibly unforgiving eye in the dim room. The broadcast is live. Bertie takes a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the dry, dusty air of his study, and begins the agonizing, terrifying process of pushing words past the iron barrier of his own throat. In this grave hour, he starts, his voice trembling slightly before finding its fragile footing. Historians still fiercely argue whether the slow, incredibly deliberate pacing of the King's wartime broadcasts did far more to gently soothe the frayed, deeply anxious nerves of the British public than the roaring, bombastic, highly theatrical rhetoric of Winston Churchill ever could. His speech is agonizingly slow, filled with long, heavy, pregnant pauses that cause the listening nation to collectively hold its breath, terrified that their monarch has finally, completely faltered under the unimaginable strain. But he does not break. He forces the locked muscles of his jaw to gently release, meticulously employing every single breathing technique he has painstakingly learned, physically wrestling the vital words into the quiet room. He does not speak to his people from an elevated, untouchable pedestal of divine right. He speaks to them from the very centre of their own profound shared terror. He remembers the cold, isolating fear of his own childhood nursery, the paralysing dread of his early naval speeches, and he gently folds that profound, quiet empathy into every halting syllable. When he tells them to stand calm, firm, and united, the words carry an immense, undeniable authenticity, simply because the listening public can actively, clearly hear the immense, agonizing struggle it takes for him just to safely deliver them. The people clustered tightly around their crackling wireless sets in damp kitchens, sandbagged pubs, and hastily dug garden shelters do not hear a fearless, roaring warrior king. They hear a deeply vulnerable, thoroughly frightened man who is bravely, stubbornly choosing to do his duty Anyway, his profound, undeniable weakness magically, miraculously transforms into his absolute greatest strength. The stammer, once his deepest, most agonizing source of personal shame, suddenly becomes the ultimate profound symbol of British resilience, a living, breathing testament to the quiet, stubborn refusal to be silenced by the encroaching darkness. He speaks of the dark days ahead, of the immense sacrifices that will be demanded, and his quiet, halting cadence perfectly matches the slow, heavy, terrifying march of the impending war. He is not minimizing the horrific danger, nor is he offering hollow, glittering promises of a swift, easy victory. He is gently, firmly taking their trembling hands and promising to walk directly into the fire alongside them. As the final, exhausted syllables of his address slowly fade into the quiet static of the airwaves, a profound, heavy silence descends upon the study. The terrifying red light abruptly blinks off, instantly plunging the room back into safe, ordinary shadows. Bertie slumps back heavily into his leather chair, completely drenched in cold sweat, his chest heaving violently as if he has just physically sprinted for miles, the sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline lingering heavily on his tongue. He has survived the impossible crucible. He has given a powerful voice to a terrified, voiceless nation, completely redefining the ancient, often disconnected purpose of the British monarchy in a single, agonizingly slow broadcast. He is no longer just the reluctant, stuttering spare who accidentally inherited a broken crown. He is now the quiet, deeply empathetic father of a frightened nation preparing for the absolute fight of its life. Outside his tall, rain-streaked windows, the wail of the very first air raid sirens violently begins to tear through the damp London afternoon, a harsh, terrifying, mechanical scream that completely shatters the melancholy quiet of the city. The false peace is entirely, permanently dead, violently replaced by the terrifying reality of total war. But as the king slowly rises from his heavy desk, straightening his crisp naval uniform with trembling but determined hands, he knows that he has successfully forged the first vital link in a long, heavy chain of national survival. He walks quietly toward the heavy oak doors, the faint scent of warm radio equipment slowly fading behind him, preparing to step out into the long, dark, terrifying night of the Blitz, armed with nothing more than his own fragile courage, the steadfast presence of his beloved wife, and the quiet, enduring love of the millions of everyday people he has just sworn to faithfully protect, knowing intimately that their shared, beautiful vulnerability will ultimately be the very thing that saves them all. The long, terrifying autumn of 1940 brings a new, apocalyptic rhythm to the beleaguered city of London, completely replacing the familiar, comforting sounds of double-decker buses and chiming clock towers with the deep, mechanical drone of approaching bomber squadrons. The night sky, once a canvas for pale stars and soft moonlight, is violently torn apart by the frantic, sweeping arcs of massive anti-aircraft searchlights, their stark, white beams slicing desperately through the thick, choking smog of burning timber and pulverized brick. Breathe in the heavy, unnatural scent of the Blitz, a bitter metallic combination of cordite, shattered glass, and the ancient damp dust of centuries-old architecture violently returned to the earth, as the relentless rain of high explosives systematically reduces entire neighbourhoods to smoking craters. The frightened government ministers frantically draft emergency contingency plans, begging the king and queen to immediately evacuate the city, or at the very least send the two young princesses across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean to the relative safety of Canada. But Elizabeth, perfectly embodying the fierce, immovable spirit of her Scottish ancestors, flatly and famously refuses the Prime Minister's desperate pleas, calmly stating that the children will not leave without her. She will absolutely not leave without the king. and the king will under no circumstances ever leave the country. They stubbornly choose to remain in the massive, highly conspicuous target that is Buckingham Palace, plunging themselves directly into the shared, terrifying crucible of their suffering people. It is a decision that permanently, irrevocably changes the fundamental relationship between the British monarchy and the common citizen. The sheer terror of the nighttime raids is a great unforgiving equaliser. Gravity and high explosives care absolutely nothing for royal bloodlines or ancient titles. When the wailing sirens begin their mournful, rising shriek, the King and Queen are forced to hurriedly grab their government-issued gas masks and make the long, undignified trek down into the damp, freezing palace basements, sharing the exact same visceral, suffocating panic as every other family huddled in the dark across the battered capital. The surreal, terrifying reality of the war literally crashes through their own front door on the cloudy morning of September 13th, 1940, when a daring German pilot deliberately targets the palace, dropping a stick of high explosive bombs that brutally shatters the ancient courtyard and destroys the royal chapel. As the deafening shockwave shatters countless priceless windows and sends a massive suffocating cloud of masonry dust billowing through the ornate velvet-lined corridors, creating what is arguably the draftiest, most uncomfortable indoor climate in all of British history, the King and Queen are incredibly, miraculously spared from being instantly crushed. Historians still marvel at the profound psychological brilliance of the Queen's immediate, almost cheerful reaction to nearly being obliterated. She famously, genuinely declares that she is actually quite glad they have been bombed because it finally makes her feel she can look the devastated East End directly in the face. This stunning admission of shared vulnerability is not a carefully crafted piece of political propaganda. It is the raw, honest truth of a leadership that has decided to bleed right alongside its people. Instead of retreating to the heavily guarded safety of the countryside, Bertie and Elizabeth don their sturdy walking shoes and step directly out into the still smoking rubble of the city's poorest, hardest hit neighbourhoods. The air in the devastated East End smells overwhelmingly of ruptured gas lines, extinguished fires, and raw, unimaginable grief. They pick their way carefully through the jagged debris of shattered homes, stepping over crushed teacups, twisted iron bedsteads, and the heartbreaking scattered remnants of ordinary lives. The King, in his crisp, understated military uniform, does not offer grand sweeping speeches or hollow, booming promises of an easy victory to the stunned, soot-covered survivors standing in the ruins. Instead, he offers his quiet, halting presence. He stops to speak with the weary air raid wardens, the exhausted nurses, and the bewildered, crying children, his own agonizing stammer serving as a profound, instantly recognizable mirror of their own deep, unspeakable trauma. He physically winces when he sees the horrific destruction, his blue eyes welling with genuine, unhidden tears as he grips the calloused hands of dock workers who have lost absolutely everything overnight. The people who mere years ago deeply questioned the necessity of this quiet, stuttering man now reach out to touch the sleeves of his uniform as if he is a living, breathing talisman of their own stubborn survival. There is a deeply moving, soft humour to be found amidst the tragedy, as the royal couple often encounters massive, unexploded bombs resting casually in the middle of busy streets, treating these terrifying, deadly weapons with the exact same polite, aristocratic disdain they usually reserve for a deeply inappropriate dessert fork at a formal state dinner. Their daily, dangerous excursions into the heart of the destruction completely erase the invisible, centuries-old barrier between the sovereign and the subject. The golden brother, David, completely fades from the public consciousness, a glittering, irrelevant ghost, wandering the safe, sun-drenched beaches of the distant Bahamas, entirely eclipsed by the quiet, unyielding courage of the fragile spare who stayed behind to hold the crumbling roof up over his people's heads. Buckingham Palace itself becomes a powerful, scarred symbol of national defiance, its boarded-up windows and shrapnel-pocked stone facade a proud, visible testament to the fact that the House of Windsor is actively enduring the exact same agonising punishment as the humblest terraced house in London. Bertie works exhaustingly long hours in his freezing, unheated study, the heavy oak desk covered in a dusting of plaster that frequently falls from the deeply cracked ceiling every time the distant anti-aircraft guns violently engage the enemy. He tirelessly reviews military dispatches by the flickering, weak light of a single kerosene lamp, his face drawn and pale, his stomach frequently clenched with the severe agonizing cramps that are the cruel physical manifestation of his unrelenting internalized stress. Yet he never once complains, quietly absorbing the immense, staggering weight of the nation's collective fear into his own frail, mortal body, as the brutal, freezing winter of the Blitz slowly gives way to the cautious, bloodied spring of 1941. The intense nightly bombings gradually begin to subside, leaving behind a profoundly altered, fiercely united island nation. The quiet, stuttering boy from the cold Sandringham nursery has finally become the indispensable, steady heartbeat of a battered but entirely unbroken empire, patiently waiting for the long, arduous road to final victory to slowly reveal itself in the fading darkness. The heavy, suffocating blackout curtains that have shrouded the bruised city of London for 5 long, agonising years are finally, triumphantly, pulled down, allowing the warm, golden spring sunlight of May 8th, 1945, to flood freely into the dusty, war-scarred corridors of Buckingham Palace. The air outside no longer carries the bitter metallic stench of cordite and pulverised brick. Instead, it is wonderfully thick with the intoxicating, triumphant scent of blooming spring jasmine, spilled warm ale, and miles upon miles of damp. Brightly coloured cotton bunting strung haphazardly across every available lamppost, the deep, terrifying drone of enemy bombers has been miraculously replaced by a massive, surging ocean of joyous human sound. A crowd of over 1 million people presses tightly against the wrought iron gates of the palace, their voices rising in a deafening, rhythmic chant that shakes the very foundation stones. "We want the king." Bertie stands in the quiet shadows of the grand antechamber, listening to the roaring tide of absolute adoration, feeling a profound, entirely unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He steps out onto the famous balcony, dressed in his immaculate naval uniform, with Elizabeth and his 2 young daughters by his side, directly into the blinding, rapturous roar of a surviving nation. It is a beautifully documented historical truth that on this day of unparalleled national triumph, King George VI broke all traditional royal protocol by inviting Prime Minister Winston Churchill to stand beside the royal family on the main balcony, publicly sharing the absolute zenith of the empire's victory with the gruff, cigar-smoking architect of their collective survival. The endless surging waves of cheering are profoundly moving, though Bertie privately finds the sheer deafening volume of the ecstatic crowd makes him feel rather like a highly celebrated, exceptionally tired West End matinee idol who would desperately prefer a quiet, solitary cup of Earl Grey tea over a continuous roaring standing ovation. The victory is absolute, but as the long, intoxicating day slowly fades into a cool, starlit night and the euphoric crowds finally begin to disperse back to their shattered homes, the massive, invisible reservoir of adrenaline that has fiercely sustained the king through the darkest years of the 20th century simply evaporates. When the terrifying crisis of the war officially ends, the brutal, physical reality of the immense toll it has taken violently crashes down upon his fragile frame. He has spent the last half-decade acting as the ultimate living shock absorber for an entire terrified empire, internalizing the crushing grief, the agonizing anxiety, and the relentless suffocating pressure of absolute duty. Now, with the immediate existential danger finally past, his exhausted body begins to quietly, undeniably fail him. The profound aching weariness settles deep into his bones, a permanent, heavy fatigue that completely refuses to be banished by any amount of sleep in his quiet, peaceful chambers. The tragic, cruel ironies of his past begin to mercilessly catch up with him. The heavy, acrid Turkish cigarettes that were so confidently, ignorantly prescribed by aristocratic doctors in his youth to magically soothe his agonizing stammer have instead slowly, silently poisoned his lungs and severely restricted his tired arteries. He develops an excruciatingly painful condition in his left leg, making the simple, previously effortless act of walking down the long, carpeted palace corridors feel like wading through an ocean of invisible, agonizing, shattered glass. Yet, the heavy, unyielding machinery of the British state demands that the sovereign must immediately transition from the stark, unifying simplicity of a global war into the messy, deeply complicated reality of a fractured, bankrupt peacetime. The grand unified political coalition that won the war swiftly dissolves, and a weary, rash and weary British public completely shocks the global establishment by overwhelmingly voting Winston Churchill out of office, replacing the roaring wartime lion with the quiet, highly pragmatic socialist leader Clement Attlee. The king, a deeply traditional conservative man fundamentally rooted in the rigid Edwardian era, must now carefully guide his battered nation through a radical, unprecedented wave of massive social change, including the complex creation of the modern welfare state and the nationalisation of key industries. Attlee is a man of such legendary, profound brevity that the weekly, highly confidential audiences between the notoriously shy monarch and the exceptionally quiet Prime Minister frequently devolve into a remarkably polite, terribly British standoff to see who can successfully communicate the most complex, highly sensitive state secrets using only raising eyebrows, subtle nods, and thoughtful, incredibly extended silences. Despite the comforting, quiet nature of his new political partner, the grueling, relentless demands of the crown offer absolutely no quarter to a dying man. He is forced to undertake exhausting, highly publicised royal tours to sincerely thank the sprawling dominions for their vital wartime sacrifices, dragging his aching, failing body across vast oceans and sweltering continents during a grueling, agonisingly long royal tour of South Africa in 1947. The blazing, oppressive heat and the punishing schedule completely drain the last, fragile reserves of his physical strength. He quietly suffers in the stifling, airless cabins of the royal train, losing a significant amount of weight, his normally sharp, handsome features becoming drawn, pale, and deeply lined with an unspoken, chronic agony. Elizabeth watches her beloved husband slowly fading away before her very eyes, her heart breaking silently as she desperately tries to shield him from the most exhausting public duties, gracefully stepping forward to absorb the crushing weight of the demanding crowds with her famous, unwavering smile. He refuses to complain, completely bound by the exact same quiet, stubborn sense of absolute duty that gave him the miraculous strength to publicly speak his own name at the terrifying coronation so many lifetimes ago. He knows, with a quiet, dignified certainty, that his own personal time is rapidly, inevitably running out, slipping through his trembling fingers like the fine, white sand of the peaceful Norfolk beaches he loved so deeply as a lonely, forgotten child. The glorious, ringing victory of the empire has ultimately cost the gentle, reluctant king his very life, slowly consuming his fragile vitality to keep the ancient, flickering flame of the monarchy burning brightly in the terrible dark. As he returns to the damp, grey chill of a battered, recovering London, wrapped tightly in heavy wool coats against the biting wind, he begins to look with profound, aching tenderness at his eldest daughter, the young, vibrant Princess Elizabeth, quietly realising that the incredibly heavy, highly dangerous golden baton he never once wanted to carry must soon be carefully, lovingly passed into her own young, unready hands, leaving him to finally seek the quiet, beautiful rest he has been so desperately denied since the very moment the golden brother selfishly walked away. The biting, damp chill of the late 1940s settles heavily over the sprawling, exhausted capital, carrying with it the unmistakable fading scent of a once boundless global empire slowly exhaling its final tired breaths. Inside the quiet, heavily shadowed walls of the royal study, the atmosphere smells distinctly of drying ink, old parchment, and the faintly spicy, incredibly distant aroma of Indian tea cooling quietly in a delicate porcelain cup. The world is shifting violently on its ancient axis, and the massive, pink-coloured map of the British Empire that once proudly dominated the grand drawing rooms of the aristocracy is being rapidly, irrevocably redrawn by the fierce, rising winds of global independence. For King George VI, the profound transition from a ruling emperor to a guiding figurehead is not marked by the loud, dramatic crash of artillery, but by the soft, relentless scratching of fountain pens, signing away centuries of absolute dominion. The most profound, earth-shattering change arrives in the sweltering August of 1947, when the vast, vibrant, deeply complicated jewel in the imperial crown India officially claims its long-awaited independence. Historians still fiercely argue whether King George VI's remarkably graceful, quiet relinquishing of the magnificent title Emperor of India was the single most vital, visionary act that ultimately saved the modern British monarchy from the violent, anti-colonial revolutions sweeping the globe, or if he was simply a highly pragmatic, deeply exhausted man who intimately recognised a massive historical tidal wave he possessed absolutely no physical or political power to stop. Regardless of the underlying philosophy, the sheer staggering volume of administrative paperwork required to peacefully dismantle an empire of that unprecedented size forces the weary civil servants in Whitehall to seemingly invent entirely new, highly complex shades of bureaucratic red tape just to keep the wooden filing cabinets from spontaneously combusting under the immense pressure. Bertie sits at his heavy mahogany desk, physically crossing out the ancient glittering imperator from his official royal signature, a tiny, quiet motion of the wrist that permanently alters the fundamental destiny of hundreds of millions of people. He does not fight the rushing tide of history. Instead, he embraces the deeply complex, highly experimental concept of the modern Commonwealth of Nations, beautifully transforming a rigid, hierarchical empire built entirely on conquest into a voluntary, loosely bound family of equal nations united by shared history and mutual affection. This incredible transformation requires him to travel extensively, pushing his failing body to the absolute brink, shaking thousands of hands in distant, sweltering territories where the blistering sun beats down mercilessly on his crisp, heavy wool uniforms. He approaches these exhausting diplomatic duties not as a conquering emperor, but as a gentle listening friend, a profound shift in royal behaviour that instantly endears him to a rapidly changing global audience. It is a staggering psychological pivot for a man raised in the strict imperial majesty of the Victorian era, a man who once watched naval dreadnoughts project terrifying power across the oceans, yet he navigates this unprecedented geopolitical minefield with the exact same quiet, stubborn empathy he used to survive his traumatic, deeply anxious childhood. The brutal, agonizing physical pain in his legs, a cruel symptom of his rapidly advancing arteriosclerosis, makes standing for long, formal state receptions feel like balancing barefoot on glowing coals, yet he continues to diligently receive the newly appointed high commissioners and foreign diplomats with a warm, unwavering smile, masking his internal torture with perfect, practiced grace. The world order is fundamentally fracturing into the terrifying icy standoff of the new Cold War, and the king watches with deep, sorrowful eyes as the devastating Iron Curtain violently descends across the broken continent of Europe he just sacrificed his own fragile health to bravely save. His once vast global authority is rapidly shrinking, fading like a beautifully painted theatrical backdrop being slowly rolled up into the rafters. Yet strangely, as his formal political power noticeably diminishes, his profound moral authority only seems to grow stronger, deeply rooted in the shared, bloody dirt of his wartime suffering. He finds a soft, quiet amusement in the bizarre, changing realities of his new post-war realm, gently joking with his closest advisors that while the sprawling British Empire might have successfully exported railways, parliamentary democracy, and polite afternoon tea to the absolute farthest corners of the globe, it is perhaps a profound divine blessing they never managed to successfully export the agonizingly unpredictable, eternally damp British weather, leaving at least one miserable freezing grey afternoon entirely to themselves. His daily life becomes a delicate, highly managed dance of meticulously conserving his rapidly depleting physical energy, perfectly orchestrated by the fiercely protective Elizabeth, who acts as a beautiful, smiling iron shield between her fading husband and the relentless, crushing demands of the newly formed, incredibly demanding government. They spend their quiet, precious weekends escaping to the ancient, towering trees of Windsor Great Park, seeking the profound, deeply necessary solace of nature, where the gentle, rhythmic rustle of the golden autumn leaves sounds infinitely more comforting than the chaotic, shouting debates echoing through the crowded benches of the House of Commons. As he slowly walks through the misty, familiar gardens, heavily leaning on a sturdy wooden walking stick, breathing in the rich, earthy scent of wet soil and dying flora, he keenly feels the immense, staggering weight of the last decade finally, completely settling into his frail, weary bones. The stuttering, terrified boy who never once wanted the dazzling crown has successfully, miraculously steered the ancient, battered ship of state through the absolute worst, most destructive storm in human history, carefully navigating the treacherous, completely uncharted waters of decolonization with a quiet, dignified grace that entirely shatters the arrogant, inflexible legacy of his golden, absent brother. But the immense, invisible cost of this extraordinary, selfless service is now demanding its final, terrible payment, extracting a massive toll from a body that was simply never designed to carry the heavy weight of the entire world. He begins to suffer from a persistent, agonizing cough that completely refuses to be banished by any amount of warm honey, soothing tea, or sophisticated aristocratic medicine, a dark, ominous harbinger hiding quietly in the deep shadows of his damaged, heavily scarred lungs, patiently waiting to extinguish the gentle, steady light he has provided for his people for so long. The magnificent, terrifying crown that was once violently forced upon his trembling head in the chaotic aftermath of abdication no longer feels like an alien, suffocating weight. It has slowly, painfully fused with his very soul, inextricably linking his rapidly fading heartbeat to the steady, enduring rhythm of the changing nation he so deeply, quietly loves, carefully preparing him for the beautiful, heartbreaking, deeply peaceful twilight of his extraordinary, completely unexpected reign. The sharp, bitter scent of medicinal tinctures slowly begins to overpower the familiar, comforting aroma of burning coal and old leather in the quiet, shadowed corridors of Buckingham Palace. The deafening roar of wartime crowds has long since faded into a distant memory, replaced now by the soft, urgent whispering of royal physicians and the gentle, rhythmic ticking of grand clocks counting down his final hours. The myth of royal passing often paints a theatrical, Shakespearean portrait of a monarch dramatically whispering empire-shaping secrets with their dying breath, surrounded by weeping courtiers in a beautifully lit chamber. The stark reality for King George VI is infinitely quieter and profoundly insulated by a well-meaning but suffocating medical establishment. In the autumn of 1951, he undergoes a brutal surgery to remove his left lung, a desperate measure designed to halt a creeping shadow. Historians still fiercely argue whether the royal medical team's unprecedented decision to deliberately conceal the terminal lung cancer diagnosis from the king was an act of profound compassion designed to spare an anxious man from terror, or a deeply unethical denial of his fundamental right to confront his own mortality. He is simply told there are structural blockages requiring rest, leaving him to blindly fight an enemy he does not even know. In this fragile twilight existence, heavily wrapped in thick woolen blankets against the creeping dampness of the English autumn, his intense focus deliberately shifts entirely away from himself and squarely onto his beloved eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth. He looks at her with a profound mixture of immense pride and sorrowful apology, knowing the crushing weight she is about to prematurely inherit. The stuttering boy, who spent his life running from the spotlight, now spends his final months teaching his daughter exactly how to stand within it. Their quiet private sessions in his study are not grand, sweeping lectures on global diplomacy, but highly practical, deeply tender tutorials on the intricate, exhausting survival mechanics of being the sovereign. He gently warns her with a weary smile that the absolute hardest burden of the crown is not the physical weight of ancient gold, but rather the endless, soul-crushing volume of municipal ribbon-cutting schedules, and the inescapable necessity of pretending to be utterly fascinated by thousands of incredibly boring local mayors. He shows her how to navigate the towering stacks of classified government red boxes, pointing out which lengthy parliamentary reports must be read and which ones can be safely ignored with an aristocratic nod, proving that even facing absolute mortality, the British instinct to efficiently manage bureaucratic paperwork completely refuses to die. As he sits in the quiet warmth of his study, listening to the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique mantel clock, he occasionally allows his thoughts to drift quietly across the ocean to his exiled, glittering older brother, David. The resentment that once burned so fiercely in his chest during the terrifying days of the abdication has long since dissolved into a soft, melancholy pity. The golden brother, who desperately wanted absolute freedom, ended up trapped in a superficial, completely meaningless life of endless cocktail parties and fading relevance, while the stuttering spare, who desperately wanted a quiet life, ended up entirely defining the moral courage of an entire century. It is a profound, beautifully ironic twist of fate that brings a tiny, genuine smile to the dying king's pale lips. He watches his daughter blossom, a steady, remarkably calm young woman who possesses the exact same unyielding, fierce devotion to duty that miraculously saved him so many years ago. The palace doctors, operating under the highly questionable exceptionally British medical assumption that politely ignoring a severe problem is perhaps the most scientifically sound method of curing it, encouraged the king to gently resume a handful of highly restricted public duties. On a freezing, remarkably bleak morning in late January 1952, he completely defies the desperate, frantic advice of his medical team to drag his fragile, aching body out to the freezing tarmac of London Airport. He stands completely exposed to the biting, freezing wind, his face pale and deeply gaunt, his heavy overcoat hanging loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame, solely to wave a final, heartbreaking goodbye to Princess Elizabeth and her husband Philip as they depart for a crucial royal tour of the sprawling Commonwealth. The wind violently whips his sparse hair, carrying the sharp scent of aviation fuel and cold rain, but he refuses to step back into the warm comfort of the waiting car until the silver airplane is nothing more than a tiny, disappearing speck in the heavy, grey clouds. It is a profound, incredibly moving display of sheer, stubborn, paternal love, completely overpowering, profound physical agony, a silent, deeply final passing of the ancient heavy torch. He returns to the quiet, familiar sanctuary of Sandringham House, the exact same freezing, isolated Norfolk estate, where his deeply anxious, deeply lonely life first began so many tumultuous decades ago. The grand circle of his extraordinary life is slowly, perfectly closing in the quiet winter frost. He spends his final days wrapped in the warm, fiercely protective embrace of his beloved Elizabeth, the woman who patiently saved his broken voice and gently healed his terrified heart. They spend the quiet afternoons peacefully completing intricate wooden jigsaw puzzles by the roaring fire, finding a profound, deeply reassuring satisfaction in successfully restoring perfect order to a completely fractured image, a quiet, beautifully poetic domestic mirror of his entire miraculous, unexpected reign. He finds a profound, beautiful peace in these simple, perfectly ordinary domestic moments, completely stripped of all the grand, terrifying imperial majesty he never once desired. He watches the winter birds scatter across the frozen, pale lawns, just as he did as a forgotten, stuttering child. But the deep, paralyzing fear that once haunted his every waking moment is now entirely, permanently gone. He has faced the absolute worst terrors the 20th century had to offer. He has miraculously held a fractured, bleeding empire together with nothing more than his own fragile courage, and he has successfully, meticulously prepared his beloved daughter to carefully guide the changing nation into a brand new, highly uncertain era. As the cold, beautiful Norfolk sun slowly dips below the jagged winter horizon, casting long, deep purple shadows across the frosted earth, the king quietly retires to his chambers, leaving the heavy, terrifying burdens of the world completely behind him in the fading light. He does not know that this is his final evening, but there is a gentle, unmistakable sense of absolute completion settling softly over his weary soul, a profound, quiet knowing that the immense, staggering debt he never asked to owe has finally, beautifully and completely been paid in full. The crisp, biting air of February 5th, 1952, wraps entirely around the sprawling Sandringham estate, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of winter frost and the earthy, rich aroma of damp pine needles. It is a perfectly ordinary, beautifully quiet Tuesday, completely devoid of the suffocating grand imperial pageantry that has defined and relentlessly consumed the last 15 years of his completely unexpected life. The myth of royal passing often insists that kings depart this world amidst dramatic, sweeping omens, perhaps a violent thunderstorm shaking the castle walls or a sudden dramatic eclipse darkening the skies over London. But the historical reality of King George VI's final day is a masterpiece of profound, unbothered domesticity, firmly rooted in the exact same muddy boots and tweed coats he has always preferred over heavy suffocating ermine. He spends the brisk afternoon out on the freezing sunlit moors, joyfully engaging in his absolute favourite pastime, shooting hares and pheasants with a remarkable steady accuracy that completely belies his rapidly failing health. The royal corgis, acting with the absolute unquestionable authority of miniature, furry despots, scamper wildly through the frozen brush, their sharp barks echoing cleanly in the still winter air, demanding their eventual dinner with far more conviction than most foreign ambassadors ever dared to demand an audience. Historians still fiercely argue whether the king subconsciously knew this was his absolute final day on earth, given the extraordinary profound peace he exuded and the highly deliberate, unusually prolonged farewells he reportedly gave to his dedicated staff and loyal gamekeepers that fading afternoon, or if it was merely the comforting, deeply settled routine of a man who finally felt a profound, untroubled contentment in his own fragile skin. Regardless of the unspoken truth, the sheer beautiful normalcy of his final hours is the ultimate quiet victory for a man who spent his entire agonizing youth completely terrified of his own shadow. He returns to the massive, warm stone house as the pale winter sun begins to dip below the frozen horizon, casting incredibly long, deep purple shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns. The air inside the grand, oak-panelled rooms smells heavily of roaring wood fires, expensive tobacco, and roasting meats, a deeply comforting sensory embrace that completely banishes the harsh, biting cold of the world outside. He enjoys a wonderfully quiet, intimate dinner with his beloved Elizabeth and his youngest daughter Margaret, the soft, familiar clinking of fine silverware and the gentle, bubbling murmur of relaxed family conversation completely masking the incredibly heavy, invisible gears of destiny slowly turning in the dark. He is deeply, physically exhausted, but it is a thoroughly clean, honest exhaustion born of fresh air and simple physical exertion, far removed from the agonizing, toxic, soul-crushing stress of the blitz or the terrifying, paralyzing anxiety of the dreaded coronation oath. After dinner, he carefully sets the ancient, heavy brass clocks around the estate, a lifelong, deeply ingrained habit that perfectly satisfies his meticulous, mechanical mind, finding a profound, comforting logic in the steady, predictable turning of the tiny, hidden gears. The quiet, unhurried rhythm of the evening is a stark, profound contrast to the chaotic, terrifying nights he spent pacing the drafty, vibrating floors of Buckingham Palace. There are no wailing sirens piercing the freezing dark, no urgent, bloodless faces of anxious ministers rushing through the heavy doors, carrying catastrophic news. There is only the soft, reassuring whisper of the wind moving through the ancient trees, a natural, enduring sound that perfectly mirrors the internal stillness he has finally achieved. He retires to his quiet, deeply shadowed bedchamber just before midnight, stepping softly over the sleeping, snoring dogs scattered across the thick Persian carpets. He picks up a small leather-bound book, reading a few quiet pages by the warm, yellow glow of the bedside lamp, entirely unaware that a continent away, in the sweltering, vibrant heat of the Kenyan jungle, his eldest daughter is sleeping high up in a giant fig tree, peacefully resting as a princess, entirely oblivious to the monumental, terrifying reality that she will ultimately climb down the next morning as a queen. The transition of the immense, crushing British crown does not occur with the loud, dramatic blowing of trumpets or the frantic, immediate signing of heavy vellum documents. It happens in the absolute, total silence of the darkest hour of the night, completely unseen and entirely unfelt by the sleeping empire. The king simply closes his heavy, tired eyes, completely surrendering to the profound, overwhelming sleep that has been desperately calling his name for over a decade. His deeply scarred, agonizingly tired heart, which bravely absorbed the unimaginable collective terror of millions of his people, finally gently stops beating, a quiet, completely peaceful mechanical failure in the dark. In maintaining his lifelong, profound dedication to avoiding uncomfortable, overly emotional goodbyes, he successfully proves that the ultimate, most sophisticated aristocratic exit is simply slipping out the quiet back door without making a single troublesome fuss when the tragic, shocking news violently breaks across the globe the following morning. It is met with a massive, unprecedented outpouring of genuine, raw, completely unfeigned public grief, an incredibly rare emotional phenomenon for a constitutional monarch in the fast-paced, cynical 20th century. The people do not simply mourn the loss of a grand, untouchable symbol of state. They deeply, fiercely mourn the loss of a gentle, utterly relatable man who bravely, stubbornly stood right beside them in the freezing, terrifying rain when the rest of the world was violently burning down. The golden, charismatic brother who selfishly walked away from the heavy burden is permanently relegated to the dusty, cautionary footnotes of modern history, while the fragile, stuttering boy who desperately fought through his own paralyzing terror to speak a few halting words of hope becomes an eternal, immovable pillar of absolute British resilience. He did not inherit a magnificent, flawless institution. He inherited a deeply cracked, highly vulnerable failing monarchy, rapidly hurtling toward total collapse. Yet, through sheer, unadulterated decency, a profound, agonizingly earned empathy, and an unbreakable, quiet devotion to absolute duty, he successfully, painstakingly repaired the shattered crown, gently polishing the tarnished gold until it brilliantly reflected the fierce, unyielding spirit of his own surviving people. He showed the world that true leadership is not defined by roaring confidence or an arrogant assumption of divine right, but by the quiet, terrifying willingness to completely face one's own profound inadequacies and choose to faithfully serve anyway. He transformed the ancient, distant institution into a fiercely beloved, empathetic family, ensuring its survival in an era that was ruthlessly dismantling other royal houses. His incredibly fragile, quietly heroic life officially ends in the deep, freezing silence of Sandringham House, but his enduring legacy is completely secured, safely embedded in the very foundation stones of the resilient modern nation he so desperately, lovingly sacrificed his own fragile existence to bravely protect. The great terrifying storm has finally, beautifully passed. The massive crushing weight has been completely, permanently lifted from his aching, tired shoulders, and the quiet, reluctant king, who never once wanted the dazzling throne, is finally, beautifully allowed to rest in the dark. The fire in the hearth has finally burned down to soft, glowing embers, casting a gentle, rhythmic pulse of amber light across the quiet room. The heavy, historic weight of the crown has been lifted. The storm has completely passed, and the world outside your window is peaceful, steady, and perfectly safe. Breathe in the cool, still air of the night, letting the long, extraordinary journey of the quiet king gently remind you that even the heaviest burdens are eventually laid down, and even the most terrifying storms inevitably give way to a profound, beautiful calm. Your own duties for the day are completely finished, your own battles are bravely fought, and there is absolutely nothing left for you to carry into the dark. Let the soft, ancient shadows wrap around you like a heavy velvet blanket, slowing your thoughts, softening your breathing, and carrying you safely into the deep, healing silence of the night. Sleep now, knowing you are completely secure. Sweet dreams.